side. But how strong is it? This is, and I quote, what his lawyers said in recent court documents. Mr. Kohberger was out driving alone. That is the alibi. Now, it is just my opinion, but it sounds flimsy at best. He was just out for a drive, and he can't say exactly where he drove, but claims he knows exactly where he wasn't, and that was at the victim's home. I think the alibi is vague, but let's really break this down bit by bit. How effective is an alibi defense in a trial, and specifically how effective this one of Kohberger's could be? To do that, we turn to former federal prosecutor and the president of West Coast Trial Lawyers, Neama Rahmani.
States require the defense to provide notice of an alibi defense if that's something that they're going to present at trial. So in this case, it could be a real alibi, or it can be a situation where the defense is really cross-examining the prosecution's evidence.
So part of this is just procedural. In the future, in order for the defense to say in court that Bryan Kohberger was anywhere but the crime scene that night, they have to file this notice of an alibi defense in advance, even if it is a weak one, which Neama agrees that this alibi seems to be.
This is a tough case for the defense, right? And they're trying to save Bryan Kohberger's life, so they're going to throw everything out there to see what sticks.
Until a verdict is read, we can only speculate as to how a jury will take in the alibi, but let me detail exactly what Kohberger claims to have been doing the night Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were stabbed to death. In court documents, his lawyers write, Mr. Kohberger has long had a habit of going for drives alone. Often he would go for drives at night. He did so late on November 12 and into November 13, 2022. Well, that sounds mighty convenient to me. You have to remember, police have gathered a lot of evidence so far, evidence that provided enough probable cause to have Kohberger arrested and charged under the presumption that where he was on the night of November 13, 2022 was allegedly inside the victim's home, committing quadruple murder.
We know that Bryan Kohberger's phone traveled from Washington State to Idaho. It didn't make it all the way to the house where the victims were murdered. And whether that's because Bryan Kohberger wasn't there, or as the prosecution claims, the phone was turned off in airplane mode, left behind, that's going to be something that's going to be a big issue at trial.
What Neama is referring to here are cell tower pings that law enforcement gathered showing Kohberger's phone traveling towards Moscow, Idaho the night of the murders, suddenly going off the grid and then reappearing sometime after the killings.
So we don't know if there's an actual alibi witness, or the defense is going to argue that because Bryan Kohberger's phone wasn't there, he was not at the scene of the murders. And I think that's why they presented this notice of alibi, to make sure they're not precluded from doing so at trial.
So the defense could argue that since Kohberger's phone can't be placed in the vicinity of the crime scene at the time the crime was being committed, he cannot be placed at the crime scene at the time the crime was being committed. My problem with that is the fact that Kohberger's phone can't be placed anywhere because it was either off or in airplane mode, according to law enforcement. Now, the other thing that his alibi defense seems to be doing is appearing to explain away this alleged footage of Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra traveling from his home in Pullman, Washington to Moscow, Idaho on the night of the murders. So let's go back to that night and talk through what circumstantial evidence law enforcement claims to have, and then put that into context with what we now know about Kohberger's alibi. Police used cell phone tower pings as well as CCTV footage taken from several cameras along the way to track the suspect's movements on the night of the killings. And they mapped out an alleged route that he took during this drive. I am intimately familiar with his supposed drive because I was reporting in Washington and Idaho, and I drove it multiple times. Now, the first sighting that investigators say they have of Kohberger's car on the move was at 2:44 a.m., leaving his Washington State University apartment and heading out of Pullman and towards Moscow, Idaho. There's a main road, the Pullman-Moscow highway, that connects these two college towns. And just before his vehicle reaches this thoroughfare, police say his phone went off the grid. Now, they believe he turned it off or put it in airplane mode to obscure his location. Now, if his alibi is to be believed, this means he would have just been driving around aimlessly for several hours with no GPS on his phone. Now, it is roughly 10 miles between Kohberger's home and the crime scene, and at that time of night, there was basically zero traffic, so it shouldn't have taken long to get from point A to point B if you were driving straight there. But Kohberger's alleged movements aren't a direct route, and that may actually, I think, firm up his alibi for a jury. At 3:26 a.m., his car was picked up on camera down this out-of-the-way residential street in Moscow, Idaho. When I drove in the area, I recall thinking this: it's odd. There isn't anything down the 700 block of Indian Hills Road but homes. It's a nice little suburban street, but kind of random. And we presume that Kohberger didn't go there to see anyone along this road because A, he never stopped the car. He was only in the area for 2 minutes before another camera captured his sedan leaving. And B, by his own admission, he doesn't have anyone to corroborate his alibi. So we can deduce he never saw or spoke to anyone there. Now, at the time I was taking the drive, my theory was maybe he just got lost. Since his phone was off, he wouldn't have had access to Waze or Google Maps or anything like this. And the roads in the area are dark and really windy. I got turned around myself multiple times and I was using GPS. But I quickly talked myself out of that theory when I considered this. The claim by police that Kohberger routinely visited the victim's home on 1122 King Road. Cops say his vehicle was spotted in the vicinity of the crime scene some 12 times prior to the murders. Now, if you drive anywhere 12 times, you probably don't need GPS to get there. But now, in light of his alibi, I think it's possible that that random little detour down Indian Hills Road might have been done with a purpose. We know Kohberger was getting his PhD in criminology and had a master's in criminal justice, so he would no doubt understand how important establishing an alibi can be. Hypothetically, if the suspect was planning on saying he was just driving around, making some seemingly random turns to nowhere may help that sound more plausible. It will be harder, in my opinion, though, to explain why his vehicle was then allegedly seen shortly after, essentially casing the home. Police claim to have tracked the white Hyundai through CCTV from that random residential neighborhood over to the victim's home. And they say his car was spotted driving back and forth around the house 3 times before appearing to park somewhere for several minutes, during which time law enforcement believes he entered the home and committed 4 murders. If the jury believes that the car in the footage is Kohberger's, it's going to be a hard sell to convince them that this portion of his journey was just a part of a random drive. Where the house is situated is down a small, out-of-the-way side street that dead ends. There is one way in and one way out, and it's so narrow that only one car can really pass at a time. Honestly, even as I am explaining it to you with video of me doing this drive right here, it doesn't really do it justice. This is just not a place you accidentally turn down or a way to cut through to another home. To get to this home, you need to deliberately go there. If the jury gets to go visit the scene, I think it's game over to convince them that Brian Kohberger was circling the home multiple times minutes before the murders by happenstance while on a joyride. Plus, the defense will have to contend with this issue of Kohberger's phone going off the grid while driving in Washington and then popping back on sometime after 5 a.m. down a random back road in Idaho.
I think the defense is really going to attack that cell site evidence because in their filings, they've also argued that the video surveillance footage of the white Hyundai Elantra is inconsistent with that evidence as well.
Any crime show can tell you that having an alibi that's "I was alone" isn't ideal, so anyone would presumably want a corroborating witness to confirm it. So who is confirming that Kohberger was in his car, alone, driving around all night, not near 1122 King Road? At this juncture, no one. His lawyers write, Mr. Kohberger is not claiming to be at a specific location at a specific time. At this time, there is not a specific witness to say precisely where Mr. Kohberger was at each moment of the hours between late night November 12, 2022 and early morning November 13, 2022. So to paraphrase, he can't tell you where he was, only where he wasn't, and as of right now, according to his own lawyers, nobody can back that story up. Now, of course, we are still in the discovery phase, and Kohberger's team is continuing to build his case, but it doesn't look like even they expect a witness to materialize to directly back up this alibi. Instead, what his team plans on doing in court is trying to corroborate his alibi through experts. Corroboration of Brian Kohberger not being at 1122 King may be brought out through cross-examination of the state's witnesses. At this time, Mr. Kohberger cannot be more specific about the possible witnesses and exactly what they will say.
It's not a real alibi defense. It's more sort of cross-examining the government's witnesses and arguing by inference that because the phone wasn't there, Kohberger wasn't there either. He was somewhere in Idaho where his phone was.
Again, we circle back to the cell tower pings and that CCTV footage. In pretrial motions, the defense has already taken issue with the science here. And specifically, they believe there's a big problem with how police were able to identify this blurry photo of a moving car as a specific white Hyundai Elantra. They're gambling here that someone on the jury won't buy that it's definitively Kohberger's car seen near 1122 King Road, which, as far as we're aware of right now, is the only thing that puts him at the scene of the crime at the time of the murders. Now, a way for Kohberger's team to get a leg up at trial is to be able to prepare for the state's strategy as early as possible. But unfortunately, the prosecution prepared for this, and they put up a huge roadblock when he was indicted through a grand jury. His lawyers recently filed a motion to vacate this indictment, and what I mean by that is that his defense team is trying to get the formal charges dropped, take us back to square one, and force a probable cause hearing. Bear with me here because it's really legally for a minute. If you've been following this case closely, you'll remember that we were all anticipating this big preliminary hearing in June, one where the prosecution would put up witnesses over the course of several days to determine whether there was enough probable cause to charge Kohberger with quadruple murder. Many of us were then shocked when that didn't happen. Instead, a grand jury was secretly convened, which subsequently indicted Kohberger on those very same charges. Now, if you are not a legal expert, you were probably confused. I know I was.
To proceed to a felony trial, one of two things has to happen. A judge needs to find probable cause at a preliminary hearing, or a grand jury has to return a true bill.
So why then is the defense trying to undo all of that and go through the whole rigmarole of a days-long preliminary hearing? You may think it's because the defense wants or expects a different result. Maybe the judge wouldn't find enough probable cause and Kohberger could go on his merry way. Highly unlikely. But this makes a lot more sense.
It would give the defense an opportunity to examine some of the witnesses, find out what the state intends to do. The defense doesn't think that there's actually a chance that the judge won't find probable cause to move forward, but what they're trying to do is force the prosecution to preview their evidence. And this is generally a mistake. It was one of the big mistakes that the LA District Attorney's Office made in the People versus OJ case.
So like Neama says, the judge is not likely to grant the motion because the burden of proof for a grand jury isn't beyond a reasonable doubt, like with a jury trial. It's simply probable cause. And in this case, the grand jury already found that there was enough of it to send the case to trial. But it's the job of the defense team to mount the strongest defense they possibly can. And in an odd way, that means playing the long game and planning for the worst, for Kohberger to lose and for them to fight for him through an appeal.
So sometimes the best defense is a good offense, or sometimes the best defense is to make the prosecution work and have to defend issues on appeal.
We won't have to wait long to hear the judge's ruling on the motion to dismiss the indictment. Brian will be back in court for a hearing on that and a few other pretrial motions on August 18th. For more true crime content like this, hit like and subscribe.